Here's the Sony UWP-D series wireless system, and here's the Sennheiser EW100 G3 series wireless system. In this video, I'm going to be comparing the two, and at the end, maybe you'll decide which one is better for you. Right now, they're very similar price ranges. This is, I think, $600, and this is about $620. So as far as price goes, they're very similar. The Sony recently released this in 2014, but the Sennheiser's been around for a while. The older model of the Sony used to be a lot bigger and heavier. They slimmed this down a lot significantly. So if one of the reasons, so if you want a small transmitter pack to put on your Talent, they are both very similar in size. Here's the Sennheiser G3 and here's the Sony. This is the pack that goes on the Talent. To access the menus on the Sennheiser, you have to flip out the door here, and then you hold that down, the on button, and as it powers on, you get into the menu system. And the menu system on the Sennheiser, it's really easy to navigate and program, and that's one of the things that I really liked with the Sennheiser wireless systems. They're very intuitive and they all make sense. With the Sonys, on the other hand, I found it a little confusing. It's very different from how the Sennheisers work, and it's not as intuitive as the Sennheisers. With the Sennheiser, these buttons, they only kind of do one thing. But with the Sony here, you have to hold two buttons down if you want to change the frequencies. When you go through different settings, you have to go up and down, and you got to do a combination of buttons. And even when you want to mute the transmitter, if your Talent wants to mute it, on the Sennheiser, there's a mute switch, an external mute switch, and that mutes the pack. When you want to mute the Sony, you hit the power button, and that light blinks, and then when you hit it again, to unmute it, it turns off. To me, it's a little more easier for the Talent, anyways, to just hit the switch. When you touch the power button, even though you're only supposed to do it once, I don't know, you might have a tendency to hold it down and it actually turns it off. The biggest difference between the two is that the Sony uses digital, a combination of digital and analog, whereas Sennheiser is just strictly an analog system. And also on the receiver, it's a true diversity. So what that means is there's two antennas, and depending on the signal, it switches between the two antennas. So if you want different strengths, you know, you could move one up, move one straight, and then depending on where the receiver is situated from the transmitter, if one signal is being disrupted, it will switch over to the other signal. The Sennheiser has kind of like a fake true diversity. There's one antenna, and there's supposed to be another antenna, I think, on the bottom of the transmitter, but you can't move them around. Whereas the Sony, you have more flexibility in that regard. The Sennheiser G3 system has developed a big following, and it's pretty well regarded with people who use this level. If you want to go above this, it's the lectrosonics. That's what the pros use in Hollywood. But the news people and the average Joe would use the Sennheiser G3s, and they've been using them for a long time. You'll find more fanboys of the Sennheiser than you will with the Sony system, in my opinion. Another big difference between these two with the receivers is, if you noticed up here, you have both output and a headphone output. And the Sennheiser only has one output. These can be controlled independently. If you're a DSLR shooter and you don't have a headphone out jack, you could plug this into your camera and another one going to your headphones, and you can monitor the audio. And I recently used this system in a kind of a different way, where I wanted to send the same signal out to two different devices. I was sending one out to my camcorder, and I sent another out to an external recording device. and I was able to control the output levels of each one differently. And that added redundancy was a really benefit for using this, the Sony. The Sennheisers, the models above this one has both the headphone and the regular output, but you pay a lot more for that functionality. The battery life between these two are very similar. I think the AA battery life on the Sennheisers is a little longer by maybe a couple hours, but with the Sony you have alternative power options. The main option is the AA batteries. That's supposed to power the transmitter and the receiver for around 6 hours. But the alternative power supplies is that there's also a USB plug right here. And if you have a USB, the same kind of 5-volt USB power, external power pack that you would power your phone or tablet, you can plug that same thing into here and it will power the device. And also if you have a Sony camcorder or camera with their proprietary hot shoe, there's an optional piece that plugs into that jack, that little input right there, and without batteries and without a cable going into the camera, you can, with that connection, both power the receiver and send the audio signal into your camera with their proprietary hot shoe. But that's only with Sony cameras. The build quality with these are all metal, and I'd say they're both pretty durable. I would give the advantage more towards the Sony because the Sennheiser, from my experience, the two things that are really flimsy is the door that goes to the battery compartment and that you need to open every time to turn it on and off and to go through the settings. This door is plastic, and over time, if you're rough with your gear, that will break. Another thing that's very fragile with these Sennheiser systems is the antenna. The antenna is only soldered to one small little point inside, and I think my antenna here is already pretty beat up and it's losing the soldering point inside here. I feel like I can just snap it open, and that causes a lot of interference, with when you're transmitting. Whereas the Sony, although these antennas are also flimsy, they feel more durable than the Sennheisers. And on the receiver, these are pretty solid here. It's a solid connection. And I trust these more than I do with the Sennheiser antenna. I think they're very similar in how far they can go, but the big difference, I think, with when you're going pretty far and with interference is when the Sonys pick up interference and get dropouts. It's a silent dropout. There's no static. It's just you hear something, and when it's interfering, you hear nothing. It's absolute silence. The Sennheiser is notorious for picking up loud, heavy static when it gets interference, and this kind of static will destroy your eardrums. It's pretty loud. It can get pretty loud. It's also in post, if you're trying to get rid, it's easier to work around a silent dropout than this loud static dropout. So that's another thing to consider between the two. When Sony designed their packs, they really thought of a lot of different things besides just the range and the signal. The body design, I think, is just a better body design than the Sennheiser. And even the cold shoe clip. With the cold shoe clip, you just hit this button here, this latch, and you can pull out the cold shoe. And if you want to put it back in, you slip in and it pops in like that. The Sennheiser, it's been the most frustrating thing for me to get this off. What you're supposed to do, the fast way to do it, is to undo these metal latches and then it comes right off. That's what I think the manual says to do. But try getting your fingernail or a tool to do that and if you do it frequently, it becomes a hassle. Now I have both wireless mics plugged into the camera, and I have the lav mics, the supplied Sennheiser ME2 and the Sony's mic. I forgot the model number, but they're both attached right below my chin and in the same distance. What I've noticed is that the Sennheiser is a lot stronger, a lot hotter than the Sony is. The Sennheiser is much more powerful, has a hotter signal. So I have to turn the Sennheiser down in sensitivity on both the transmitter and the receiver. And with the Sonys, it's only like I have to actually amplify the Sony a little bit. The transmitter is at 0, but the receiver is at +3. And on my camcorder, it's both at the 10 o'clock position on manual recording. There's no attenuation on. So with the same mic level input on my camera, it's a pretty significant difference between the Sony and the Sennheiser as far as the sensitivity and the amount of power that goes in from the system into the camera. All right, so my final thoughts between these two, I was just thinking, after doing that lav test, the sensitivity test, a lot also has to do with these lav mics. So maybe I'm thinking the Sennheiser lav mic, this ME2, is just a lot more sensitive than the Sony, the mic that comes with the Sony. That could be the case of why the Sennheiser was getting a more powerful signal. I'm not sure. The best way to test this is to use the same exact mic, lav mic for each on both of them, but I'm just using what was supplied in the kit, and in the kit the Sennheiser is just a lot stronger signal. There's a lot to like with this Sony system, and I feel like, having used it for a little bit, I'm pretty sold on these Sony systems. And even though the Sennheiser has a stronger signal and it's a lot easier to navigate through, I think the Sony has a bit more features to offer for the price, and I can see myself purchasing a couple more of these Sony units and maybe just holding on to these Sennheisers as my backup. I have 2 sets. I can just keep those around, but I feel like the Sonys is the future. So unless Sennheiser comes out with a newer, like a G4, in the same price range and not the other Sennheiser, like the more expensive ones that they offer right now, that has much better features than the Sony, with the dual outputs, but like at double the cost, more than double the cost. I think the Sony right now, the way I see it, is the better value, and I think I'm gonna buy more of the Sony.